What Russia did in the past 72 hours crossed a line that NATO's leadership had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, the alliance did not hesitate. They responded with speed, with precision, and with a unity of purpose that caught even seasoned analysts off guard. For months now, there had been signals, not official statements, not formal declarations, just signals that Moscow was preparing something unusual. Russia has been aggressive, yes, but they have been methodical in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a cadence, almost a predictability. But what set off alarm bells in Brussels and Washington this week was that the rhythm went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Russian military behavior know the indicators. The rotation of high-readiness units toward forward positions, the sudden surges in encrypted communications traffic, the repositioning of strategic air assets to forward operating bases, the quiet disappearance of senior commanders from their normal communication patterns, all of that went quiet. And whenever the Kremlin goes quiet, it means something is about to get very loud. Senior officials at NATO headquarters began convening emergency sessions as early as 4 days ago, not because they had hard evidence of what was coming, but because the absence of signals was itself a signal, a deeply worrying one. Staff who have worked these intelligence desks for years describe the atmosphere in those meetings using a word you don't hear often in NATO corridors: eerie. Early this week, Allied intelligence services detected what they described as an unprecedented consolidation of offensive capabilities along Russia's western military district, including the repositioning of long-range ballistic missile systems that had not been moved in over 18 months. These are the kinds of assets that Moscow only moves when they are signaling something very specific: a readiness to escalate, a willingness to test the alliance's resolve, or a preparation to take action that cannot be walked back. NATO's intelligence directorate didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Russia was changing its strategic posture. And when a nuclear power shifts its strategic posture without explanation, even by a fraction, the alliance pays attention. The movement of these systems was not covert. That's what made it so alarming. Moscow wanted it to be seen. This was a deliberate, calculated act of signaling, the kind that says, "We are ready, and we want you to know we are ready." But signaling only works when the other side blinks. And NATO, for the first time in years, was ready for exactly this moment. The statement issued by the NATO Secretary General tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Official after briefing described Russia's move as destabilizing, deliberately provocative, and perhaps most critically, pre-decisional, meaning NATO believed Moscow had not yet committed to a course of action, but was positioning to do so at a moment of its choosing. But deterrence only works if the target hesitates. Moscow did not hesitate, and so NATO did not hesitate either. In fact, the alliance's response today was among the most coordinated and assertive we have seen in the post-Cold War era. Here's what we know. Within hours of detecting Russia's repositioning, NATO activated its Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, the alliance's most combat-capable rapid deployment formation. These weren't the routine readiness drills. These were full-spectrum activation orders, formations, and systems that NATO only deploys when it is preparing to defend, deter, or, if necessary, respond in kind. Tonight, multiple senior alliance officials confirmed that NATO launched an extraordinary diplomatic and military signaling operation targeting every axis of Russian pressure, including a formal notification to the Kremlin that specific thresholds had been identified, that Moscow had 48 hours to provide clarification of its intentions, and that any further escalatory movement would be met with a response that would permanently alter Russia's strategic calculus. That 48-hour clock is now ticking. NATO made clear it had pre-positioned forces capable of closing the airspace over contested zones at a moment's notice, activating missile defense batteries across the eastern flank, and bringing to bear a layered deterrence architecture that Russia had previously underestimated. In other words, NATO targeted Russia's window of opportunity. The assumption in Moscow was that the alliance was divided, slow, and hamstrung by political disagreement. Tonight, NATO proved that assumption catastrophically wrong. This is what made the alliance's response so significant. Russia's repositioning wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of posture shift that could trigger cascading escalation if left unchallenged. And NATO, understanding that fully, responded with clarity, not recklessly, not impulsively, but with overwhelming strategic purpose. They didn't panic, they didn't overreach, they drew a line. one that no one expected them to draw this fast and this clearly. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Senior analysts now believe that Russia's latest move was designed to probe the cohesion of the alliance after years of perceived weakness, disagreements over burden sharing, wavering political will in certain capitals, and the fatigue of a prolonged conflict. Moscow wanted to see whether NATO would fragment under pressure, whether it would respond with half measures. But instead, the opposite happened. The alliance didn't fragment. They issued a unified declaration that was so precise, so operationally specific, that even the Kremlin's most experienced war gamers took notice. You don't get Moscow's attention easily. But tonight, NATO did. Analysts speaking with major Western media outlets under conditions of anonymity described Russia's gambit as a classic escalate to de-escalate maneuver, a doctrine designed to create fear without triggering a full response. But NATO proved today that it remains both strategically coherent and operationally ready. Their response was not only diplomatically firm, it was militarily credible. So precisely communicated that, according to one senior official, it removed every ambiguity Moscow was trying to exploit. That clarity matters because it shows NATO is not reacting. It shows that NATO is dictating the terms. They are not a passive target waiting to be shaped. They are an active architecture with predetermined responses to predetermined provocations. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the full scope of NATO's response. Allied air forces carried out synchronized readiness flights across the eastern flank, forcing Russian early warning systems into sustained activation, a resource-intensive posture Moscow had not anticipated needing to maintain. Naval assets from multiple member states repositioned in the Baltic and Black Sea regions, including vessels that had been in routine transit just 72 hours ago. Intelligence sharing assets operating across the continent reportedly cataloged every piece of Russian military hardware that had moved in the past week, assets Moscow believed had been moved without detection. This wasn't just a message. This wasn't just a show of strength. This was synchronized alliance deterrence. This was unified strategic coherence. And unified strategic coherence is the one thing Moscow has struggled to undermine since the beginning of this crisis. For every wedge Russia attempted to drive between NATO members, the alliance countered with something that deepened unity rather than fractured it. Remember, Moscow thought the alliance was too divided to act decisively. They thought the eastern flank nations would panic and act unilaterally, breaking consensus. They thought the larger Western powers would prioritize economic considerations over military solidarity. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. NATO spoke with one voice, and that voice set a 48-hour deadline. The eastern flank nations demonstrated the most operational preparedness seen since the Cold War, and the major Western powers committed capabilities that signaled not reluctance but resolve. History will record this moment as the day NATO rediscovered the clarity of purpose that defined its founding decades. What makes this moment so consequential and so dangerous is that Russia's latest move happened at a time when Vladimir Putin is under immense internal pressure. The military-industrial complex wants results it can show to domestic audiences. The hardline nationalist faction wants escalation, not negotiation. The Technocratic Security Council wants de-escalation before the economic costs become irreversible. And the international partners Moscow has cultivated want stability, not a wider conflict that destroys the trade relationships they've carefully maintained. Putin is balancing all of these demands simultaneously while managing a military that has suffered significant attrition and a domestic narrative that is increasingly difficult to sustain. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they are not doing it from strength. They are doing it from pressure. They are doing it from vulnerability. The missile repositioning, the communications blackout, the deliberate visibility of the moves, these are not the actions of a confident power. They are the actions of a leadership looking for leverage it doesn't currently have. That is a critical insight because it means tonight's 48-hour ultimatum is not just a military message. It is a political message aimed directly at the factions inside the Kremlin that are pushing for escalation, telling them the cost of that path is higher than you've calculated. NATO's formal statement, now transmitted through every official diplomatic and military channel, was designed to signal that the alliance is not willing to allow a fait accompli, a move by Moscow that changes facts on the ground before the West can organize a response. Senior officials said plainly that Russia's repositioning was inconsistent with the obligations of responsible nuclear stewardship and the norms of European security. That is extraordinarily precise diplomatic language for, we know exactly what you're doing, stop. You don't usually hear that tone from NATO unless the situation has crossed into genuinely dangerous territory. The fact that these words were chosen, cleared through 32 member states, and released in unison within hours of the intelligence assessment tells you everything about the seriousness of what was detected. There was no debate about whether to respond. There was only debate about how clearly to state the terms. They chose maximum clarity. Meanwhile, the NATO Secretary General addressed the press in Brussels in a direct, unflinching statement tonight. He said, "The alliance has detected movements that require immediate clarification from the Russian Federation." He said, "We have communicated our expectations clearly, and we expect a response within 48 hours." And he said, "NATO does not seek confrontation, but NATO will not be coerced." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from an institution that understands just how high the stakes have become. They are measured, they are proportional, and they are backed by the full weight of the most powerful military alliance in human history. If there is a single sentence that defines this moment, it may be that last one. NATO will not be coerced, because that is the sentence that answers the question Moscow has been asking for years. How far can we push? Tonight, NATO answered, this far, not 1 inch further. Here's what makes the situation even more complex. Russia's latest move wasn't isolated. Along with the missile repositioning in the Western Military District, Belarusian forces also increased operational tempo along the Polish and Lithuanian borders, a move analysts believe was coordinated rather than coincidental. Hybrid operations, and including cyber attacks against infrastructure in 3 NATO member states, spiked sharply in the 48 hours preceding the repositioning. Russian state media dramatically amplified messaging targeting public opinion in key European capitals, attempting to generate political pressure on alliance governments from within their own societies. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When Moscow moves multiple pieces simultaneously, military, cyber, informational, it means something larger is being orchestrated. This is not improvisation. This is a campaign. And what NATO did tonight was call that campaign by its name. Senior analysts are now considering several distinct possibilities. One is that Russia is preparing for a major escalatory action and use the repositioning to test NATO's detection capabilities and response speed, essentially a rehearsal. Another is that Moscow is attempting to force a negotiated settlement by creating fear of a wider war, believing that Western publics will pressure their governments to offer concessions to avoid conflict. A third possibility, the one that is worrying officials the most, is that Russia is attempting to establish a new deterrence baseline to normalize the presence of certain systems in certain positions so that eventually their presence is no longer treated as escalatory. But tonight, NATO took that third option off the table. They didn't issue vague statements. They didn't convene a working group. They didn't schedule a meeting for next month. They issued a deadline, stated a threshold, and activated their forces. The message, there is no new normal here. There is only the line, and Moscow is standing at it. What we are watching now is a test of resolve. Moscow wants to see whether NATO's unity is structural or situational, whether it holds under pressure or collapses into competing national interests when the cost of solidarity rises. NATO wants to show that its deterrence posture is not theoretical, that it is operational, credible, and immediate. Washington wants to prevent a miscalculation by either side that pulls the world toward a confrontation nobody wants. And European capitals, particularly those on the eastern flank, want to prevent a repeat of the assumption that defined the early post-Cold War era, that European security could be taken for granted. This moment is not just about what Russia does in the next 48 hours. It is about what the next decade looks like. The line NATO drew tonight, the speed with which it was drawn, the precision with which it was stated, the unity with which it was delivered, will echo far beyond this crisis. Tonight, we've heard from intelligence officials who are now monitoring Russian command communications with extraordinary intensity. They say the 48-hour window is real, not a public relations gesture, but a genuine operational threshold beyond which NATO's posture will shift permanently. They say the Kremlin has received the message in its full clarity and is now engaged in internal deliberation about how to respond. And they say Russia's decision to make its repositioning visible was almost certainly miscalculated, that Moscow expected fear and received instead a unified and immediate counter-signal that changed the strategic equation. But NATO is not standing still. In fact, NATO is accelerating. Their response today, measured, credible, and operationally meaningful, sent a message to Moscow that the era of probing without consequence is over. And it sent a message to every NATO member state and to every nation watching from the outside that the alliance is still the most consequential security architecture the world has ever produced. As the next 48 hours unfold, we expect more details to emerge about exactly what Russia hoped to achieve with this repositioning and whether the Kremlin will provide the clarification NATO is demanding. But what we do know is that the alliance's response was timely. It prevented a window of ambiguity from hardening into a new strategic reality. It reestablished deterrence credibility at a moment when that credibility was being tested. And it demonstrated that 32 nations can, when the moment demands it, speak in one voice, clearly, firmly, and without hesitation. What happens next will depend entirely on what Moscow does before that clock runs out. If Russia withdraws the repositioned systems and provides credible clarification, this moment may be remembered as the day deterrence worked, the day a line was drawn and held. If Russia does not, NATO has already shown it is not waiting to be surprised. They have shown they are watching. They have shown they are ready. They have shown they will respond. And tonight, for the first time in years, Moscow appears to be calculating rather than pushing. The Kremlin is quiet, unusually quiet. And when the Kremlin is quiet, it means they are not posturing. It means they are thinking. They are choosing their next move carefully, because tonight Russia learned something its own doctrine should have told it long ago. A unified alliance with a clear threshold is not a target. It is a wall. An ultimatum with operational backing is not a bluff. It is a decision. And a line drawn in public by 32 nations in 32 languages cannot be quietly erased. This story is far from over. The 48-hour clock is running. The world is watching. But tonight, one thing is absolutely clear. NATO drew a line no one expected. Moscow has a decision to make, and the alliance is ready, whatever that decision turns out to be. We will be here, watching every development as the next phase of this crisis unfolds.